June 21st, 2023. Well, I'm going to do another update here on the situation in the Ukraine war. We've passed the second week of the famous Ukraine offensive, and we're moving into the third week here. And so far, I don't think a whole lot of things have changed since last week. There have been some, I'd say, modest Ukrainian advances in various sectors of the Zaporizhian front in the south, and there are there's several different penetrations that are fairly shallow. So it doesn't look like they've been able to develop a single point to actually launch a detailed offensive. The general theory of most commentators is that the Ukrainians want to reach a town of Mariupol, which is, down toward from the front line toward the sea. Apparently they get in position to try to bombard Crimea or something like that. But so far they haven't really made a whole lot of advances. There's like about 3 different areas where there's been some modest penetration. One is very far to the west of the Zaporizhian front, and that one's penetration is modest. There's one a little further over, and it's actually taken up a bunch of open fields areas, pretty much, I'd say, and they've actually made some advances there, but it seems like they're currently stalled. And then the initial penetration, which is still a little further over, hasn't really changed a whole lot because they certainly have occupied the low ground, but the Russians still hold the high ground. Now, they better watch out because, of course, there's a correlation of about 5 Ukrainian brigades that have yet to be fully committed. In fact, I think four of them haven't been, and they're more mechanized and armored formations that are kind of developing a little bit on the side of that penetration. And there's a few other clashes further along. But so far, the Ukrainian offensive has hardly been what it's been advertised to be. They've taken a lot of casualties in armor, and now in the second week they tended to move toward more of a leading first with infantry to take over positions and then move their heavier vehicles up second. Largely because I think of all the minefields that they're dealing with, which are pretty extensive. And the Russians are using helicopters with long-range missiles, laser-guided missiles firing from several kilometers away, outside of the range of the Stingers and other weapons of that sort, and hitting various armored vehicles. There are different claims. We do know that one of the helicopters was hit. The tail section was blown off, but it was able to recover and fly back to base. There are other claims that other helicopter may have been shot down. It's hard to know. A lot of claims in these wars, So that's kind of how it's going. But if you like these videos, please subscribe. Give me a like. That helps out a lot with the algorithm, and you can forward to anybody that might be interested. The links of them, that is. Yeah, and so that's kind of the basic thing there. Now, the other development that's starting to kind of play into this whole saga is that the Russians and areas on the what we might call the eastern front, the vertical front more or less that goes up on the side of the L, if you will, if you look at that L-shaped Russian position. There's areas like Mariupol, for instance. The Russians are actually resumed offensive. I think after the first week or so, there was a period there where the Russians kind of ended offensive operations for the most part, kind of waiting to see what happened in the south. But since there hasn't been a lot of penetrations, they've resumed offensive operations and have done a couple of things. They took old tanks that were probably close to useless and converted them into autopilot vehicles as a kind of a suicide tank and loaded them up with explosives and drove them into some Ukrainian positions. One of them succeeded getting in there, but the other one, the first one, got caught in a minefield and apparently hit with an anti-tank weapon, but the Ukrainians then blew up with a massive explosion, probably creating a shockwave. So this is a new development. We haven't seen this before. And there's also so that attack is pending. There's also several other attacks up and down the line. One thing that's kind of notable on the Ukrainian side is they still have a massive concentration of forces around Bakhmut. Although they haven't taken it yet, they are continuing to try to chip away at the flanks of it. So, and of course, we know that's the kind of the apple in Zelensky's eye. So we'll have to see if this turns into more. But I would say that the Russians definitely need to be, looking at that as an area where they may be vulnerable. To the north, the Russians are engaged in offensive operations up there as well. So basically on the eastern front, the Russians are kind of beginning to chip away with offensive operations, sort of like the Ukrainians have been doing on the southern front. So and in fact, it makes some sense that Russia would, if nothing else, want to pose some kind of a threat, so that Ukrainian uncommitted reserves might get distracted from the southern operation when they plan to make a major breakthrough and get distracted up to deal with areas outside their primary focus. And so that's kind of the state of affairs as I see it. The battles are ongoing and in some places are quite intense. But since the Ukrainians are continually launching the offensive operation, one would assume that they're taking the heaviest casualties, both because of the air superiority, artillery superiority the Russians have, and all these suicide drones that the Russians have become quite competent at. I know earlier in the war, we were making a big deal that we had this Switchblade drone that we gave the Ukrainians. Well, apparently two can play at that game, and so now the Ukrainians are getting hit with these other weapons. And so that's kind of a situation. It's generally thought to be that the one motivating factor is an upcoming NATO summit starting around the 10th or 11th of July, and that there's a big political motivation to show some kind of results for all the equipment that the Western countries have been providing to Ukraine before that time in order to, I guess, justify more shipments or more larger shipments. Although it's unclear at this point what's available to be shipped. And so that's, fits into the whole mix here. But I think up at this point, anybody who was hoping that the Russians would just collapse under this assault are going to be sorely disappointed. That's not to say that as the battle wages forward that there won't be additional Ukrainian advances, because there probably will be. But it looks like Russia's attacking on the eastern front, taking advantage of the Ukrainian focus on the southern front. And I think that's a real situation for them to decide how much the Ukrainians want to sacrifice their assault capabilities, because if they go too far and weaken themselves too much, then they will be potentially vulnerable to some kind of a major Russian counteroffensive, which I don't see happening yet. I think right now that they're just chipping away a little bit like they've done before. I don't think they're really committing to a heavy offensive operation yet, and we probably won't in the week ahead as people would be watching this. But I think that's kind of the situation. Another development that's interesting on the political front is apparently Putin displayed some document in a kind of a press conference he was in recently, in the last couple of days, in which he noted that an agreement that had been initialed in a negotiation, I guess last April, of peace negotiation, which, if you remember at the time, was moderated by the Turkish government, and that the two sides were coming to kind of an agreement. And apparently part of the agreement was, as a sign of good faith, the Russians would withdraw from the area around Kyiv and pull back out, which they did. And at the time, then of course Boris Johnson, who was at the time Prime Minister of Britain, came in and convinced the Ukrainians to back out of the peace negotiation, and which was also supported also by U.S. delegates. And so they did, and the peace negotiation fell flat. But essentially, Putin is claiming that the Ukrainians were on the verge of making a peace deal, which would have essentially allowed the Ukrainians to have sovereignty, I guess, over everything but Crimea, and that in return for providing rights, legal rights, and support to Russians living in the Donbass region, and would have, you know, imposed certain restrictions on the armaments that the Ukrainians could have. But that was pretty much nixed with supporting Western powers, so the war raged on for months afterwards. So that's kind of a propaganda move from Putin, but apparently it's true based on all the knowledge we have that at the time, as I recall, it seems very analogous to the contemporary information we had at the time. So we'll see where that goes. Also, Russia is now deploying nuclear weapons into Belarus. And people on some of these shows I'm hearing are kind of confused at what they're sending. I think pretty much, I can say pretty much most likely what they're sending are warheads for Iskander missiles, which are probably, I would disagree with McGregor on his statement. I think that these are more in the 50 kiloton range. They're theater ballistic missiles, operational missiles. And it's probably designed for the Russians to put a kind of a pretty firm position in Belarus to say, don't touch. You know, and I think that I don't know that Ukraine or NATO would plan on attacking Belarus, but there's been attempts to promote revolution, you know, in Belarus before from Western influences. So I think that's part of this effort. It also would give him strike capabilities against NATO air bases, if they, in Poland and so forth, and also the Baltic states, if they were to enter the conflict, which I don't think there's any plan to do that, but it's always a thing that a prudent planner on the Russian side would be worried about, and obviously something I guess Zelensky's been hoping for, because he keeps pushing for the idea of Ukraine being admitted to NATO. But it would seem if Ukraine was admitted to NATO at this point during the war, if the war hadn't been resolved yet, essentially they would simply invoke Article 5 and we'd be at war with Russia on a much bigger scale if we honored the treaty. And if we're not going to honor the treaty, we wouldn't really want to set up a situation like that where we wouldn't honor the treaty. So that's that. So anyway, kind of enough for the war, but I thought I would go through all that in week's developments. Also, before I close, I'll make a comment that, of course, we had a sham outcome here in the Hunter Biden plea bargain, which essentially takes massive tax fraud on his part and basically turns it into a misdemeanor, and also is going to give him a pass on his gun charge, where that if he'll be on a diversion program, and if he completes his probation for a certain period of time in a diversion program, that the felony charges will be dropped and he'll be free to purchase guns in the future. I mean, I think overall this is a sham, and I think the Republican prosecutor that was left over from the Trump administration that's handling this thing in Delaware, I mean, why are you doing this? I mean, if you can't do what's right, why don't you just resign? I mean, but at any rate, that's what's happening. So anyway, I'll wrap this up for now. As always, my addresses of my social media accounts will be in the description below. I'll also be posting this on Rumble. And until next time.